When I was in college, I went to college in Minnesota. My parents lived in northern Maine. I would take a bus all the way from Caribou to Boston and then fly from often Boston to Atlanta to Minneapolis. Doesn't make any sense, but that's what you would do. It was a long day, but I remember one time I was traveling back to college. I think it was on the ride from Portland to Boston. I sat next to a very interesting man who was a writer of a particular sort, and we had quite a conversation for a couple of hours. I was someone who was interested in writing, and we talked about that some. I also knew something about his religious beliefs because on the back of his book that he showed me, it said that he was a deist. Now, I don't know if you know what that means, because it's not very popular nowadays, but it was a big thing about 300 years ago. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and others were influenced by deism. Basically, deists believe in God, but don't believe that God actively intervenes in the world. Deists believe that God created the world like the perfect machine and just set it running. In their view, if you made it right, why do you need to tinker with it? So, this was his view. I had a 2-hour conversation with him, and during this 2-hour conversation, it never came up, or I never brought it up that I was a Christian and got into a conversation about matters of faith. And I remember the friend who picked me up from the airport witnessed to him. He said, no, and he said, why not, right? You had this great opportunity. Why didn't you do this? Now, I grew up in this kind of culture where, if you have an opportunity to tell somebody, you should tell them. When else are you going to tell them? And at the time I wondered, why was it that I didn't? Should I have? Certainly there are ways that sometimes Christians can do this that are unhelpful. The person who's next to you on the plane may not always appreciate it if you feel like they're a captive audience and you can sort of drill them for 2 hours or whatever. It may be counterproductive. You have to be wise about these things. But I wonder if in that conversation I had opportunities to express at least some curiosity about his views. Or maybe even just let him know why I couldn't follow his suggestion. When I let him know I was interested in writing, he suggested that if I really wanted to make money, I could write a certain kind of literature that would be profitable that Christians shouldn't be reading. And I didn't bother to tell him, no, I can't do this, and that's why. And I wondered afterwards, did I avoid speaking up out of fear? Was I intimidated by him in some way? Now, our witness is more than what we say, and it does include that, of course. It includes being ready and willing to boldly speak the truth in love, both in times of opportunity and in times of testing. Today we're going to be looking at a passage in the 18th chapter of John's Gospel in which we see both a positive example of boldly speaking the truth at a time of testing and a negative example of it. Now last week we read the part of the story that leads into this about the encounter in the garden between Jesus and those who came to arrest him, in the first part of John 18. And so we pick up at the end of that scene in John chapter 18, verse 12, and we'll read 12 to 14 to start. It says, "So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people." The word that's used for officer here is the typical term for a Roman tribune, a high-ranking Roman official. It's interesting that this word would only be used now, but perhaps because throughout the scene we looked at last week, Jesus was portrayed as the one in command, not anyone coming to arrest him. I should say, though, as a possible word of correction, I mentioned last week that reading John's Gospel, you get the impression that there are Jewish police forces as well as Roman soldiers, as well as Judas coming to arrest Jesus, and then in some way this is representative of the rebellion of the whole world against Jesus. And certainly the way that John uses the language can suggest that, but the term for the group of soldiers that would refer to a Roman unit could also be used for the Jewish unit. The other Gospels don't mention any Romans arresting Jesus in the garden. It would have been unusual for Roman soldiers to be involved in this kind of a police action. You know, why use the army when usually this is the police's job? It also would have been strange for Roman soldiers if they arrested someone to bring them to the Jewish authorities. In any case, John tells us that this group brings Jesus to Annas. Only John mentions this Jesus being brought to Annas in this context. It seems like this is a scene where it's like an initial interrogation. Rather, the other Gospels tell of that full trial. John will just kind of move past it. But Annas was a figure who was very influential among Jewish religious leaders. He was actually a past high priest, which is kind of strange if you think of the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, a person becomes high priest. They're high priest until they die. But in the first century, sometimes the Romans stepped in and said, no, you're not high priest anymore. We're going to make this other person high priest. Right? The Jews didn't always like that, but that was what was happening. Annas, though, still exerted a lot of influence. He was sort of the patriarch of the family of high priests. We're told he's the father-in-law of the current high priest, Caiaphas, and also all 5 of Annas' sons would be high priest at some time. So Jesus is brought to Annas. There's also a reminder here of the prophecy, really, that Caiaphas had uttered back in chapter 11, verse 50, that it was better to have one person die for the people. Just as in chapter 11, there's 2 things that this reminds us of. One is that Jesus' death will be for the people. Caiaphas unwittingly, that's all right, Caiaphas unwittingly spoke the truth about Jesus' death being beneficial, sacrificial for the whole people. But it also reminds us that Jesus, the verdict against Jesus has been issued before the trial has happened. This is not the way justice is supposed to work, right? You're not supposed to be pronounced guilty and worthy of death before you go to trial. And reminds us that the proceedings that are about to happen for Jesus will be fundamentally unjust. The scene shifts in verse 15. We'll read verse 15 and 16 now. It says, Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. Now the other disciple here is not mentioned, so is technically anonymous, and there may be a purpose for this. Because he's anonymous, he in some ways functions as a representative disciple or an ideal disciple. Particularly because, and it may be the same individual that's the beloved disciple who's also anonymous in John's gospel. In both cases, it's presumably the author, John himself. But by being anonymous, he serves as this representation of what a disciple can be. And notice that it says that he is with Jesus. He goes with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. He seems unafraid to be known as Jesus' disciple. There's a contrast between him and Peter. Peter is portrayed as standing outside. The other disciple goes with Jesus. Peter is outside. Verses 17 and 18. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. This woman, it was her job to know who's on the premises. She's the doorkeeper. And so when a stranger comes to the door and she's asked to let him in, she knows she might be asked later, "Who was this guy that you let in?" So just do it. This other guy, you're one of Jesus' disciples? That would make sense, right? Why else would a stranger be coming in at this time of night? Peter, though, is more afraid of her question, more afraid of her than he is afraid of denying Jesus. Think about that. Peter says, "I am not." You may recall from last week's passage that Jesus says again and again, "I am. I am." Now, throughout John's gospel, this has been an affirmation that Jesus is divine. Obviously, Peter is not divine, cannot say "I am" in the same way, but we're probably meant to see these two statements in contrast. Jesus owns up to who he is. Peter does not. Where the other disciple was said to be with Jesus, Peter now stands with the people who arrested Jesus around a charcoal fire. There will be another charcoal fire later in the Gospel of John when Jesus will serve Peter and others breakfast. The connection is probably intentional. A charcoal fire tends to be more warm than bright, and this may have allowed Peter to remain unrecognized at first. Though the way Peter warms himself is not mentioned, the point here is that this is more a picture of intimacy with the arresting party rather than identification with Jesus. I know when I'm near a fire and it's cold out, I want to warm my hands up, right? Jesus' hands at this time are bound. The text has been deliberate about that. Jesus is standing inside being interrogated with bound hands. Peter, meanwhile, is warming his hands by the fire with the very people who bound Jesus. The scene shifts back to Jesus in verse 19. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." John is using a literary technique that we see often in Mark's gospel. It's often called a Markan sandwich, where you start with one story, you go to the other, and then you're going to come back to the first. And in these cases, the two stories are meant to be interpreted against one another or together with one another. So in this case, Jesus is being offered is being put forward as a contrast to Peter, or rather, other way around, Peter as a contrast to Jesus. Here, just as in the arresting scene, we see Jesus acting as the one in charge. Even though he's being interrogated, the questions of the interrogators are not given. John instead emphasizes Jesus as the one who is speaking, the one who is asking questions, the one who is giving direction, giving commands. Jesus speaks truthfully and boldly. He does not exhibit fear in this circumstance, and this would have seemed unusual to the priests and those who had arrested him. The typical behavior, and we know this from the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote about many such encounters in the first century, the typical behavior was for prisoners to be basically begging. And yet, Jesus doesn't do this. Quite the contrary. Jesus doesn't need to add to what he's spoken openly. And in fact, here he says, "You can ask those who heard me." Now there's an irony here. One of those who heard him often is standing outside in the courtyard warming himself by the fire. Verses 22 to 24. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Jesus continues throughout this scene to stand for the truth, to speak the truth. One of the interesting features of this passage is that the identity of the high priest here is ambiguous. Back in verse 13, we were told that Caiaphas was the high priest, so we might assume that Caiaphas is the one questioning Jesus. But then in verse 24, we're told that Annas sends Jesus to Caiaphas. So wait a minute, is Annas the high priest? But then in 24 it also says that Caiaphas is the high priest. This ambiguity may be meant to raise the question, who is the true high priest? And the answer that John seems to want us to come up with is that the true high priest is Jesus. Jesus is the one who presents the perfect sacrifice for the people. Shockingly, that sacrifice is himself. The New Testament book, Hebrews, deals with this theme at great length. But here it seems to be the point as well. And this question about how to respond to the high priest that's asked of Jesus should now be reversed. Jesus was asked, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" And yet the person who asked it should be asked, "How can you strike the true high priest?" One traditional way of talking about Jesus' ministry and mission is that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament offices of prophet, priest, and king. And we see all three themes in John's gospel. The prophet is the one who faithfully speaks God's word again and again. Jesus has told us throughout John's gospel that he speaks the words the Father gave him to speak. He is the true prophet. Here he is also portrayed as the true priest, and next week we will see the true king. We're going to finish the passage we're looking at today with verses 25 to 27. Shifting back to Peter. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment the cock crowed. You may recall from the passage last week that Peter had taken out a sword and, well, it's probably a long knife or short sword, but he cut off the ear of Malchus, who was For Peter to act in that way, seemingly in defense of Jesus, must have required great courage and devotion. And yet Jesus had rebuked Peter. Even after the rebuke, though, Peter continues to pursue Jesus. He continues to follow, to want to stay close to him. He's not with him the way the other disciple is, but he wants to stay close. And that also must have taken courage and devotion once Jesus is arrested. But now we see again Peter's courage fails. When he's put on the spot, when his connection to Jesus is questioned, he denies first here that he's Jesus' disciple. He denies also that he was with him. Peter had just earlier that night told Jesus that he would lay down his life for him. And Jesus had prophesied back in chapter 13, verse 38. Will you lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Jesus, the true prophet. Peter had desperately wanted to follow Jesus. But he had placed his confidence in the wrong place. He'd placed his confidence in his own resolve, his own courage, his own determination. What Peter really needed was for Jesus to give his life for him. Now, this isn't the end of the story for Peter. After Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, he's going to get another chance. Another chance to be with Jesus. Another chance to bear faithful witness. A personal encounter with Jesus will open Peter's heart and mind to the truth that the cross was for his forgiveness. And with his confidence then in the atoning work of the true high priest, Peter will be able, by God's grace, to bear witness. And so can we. But to do that, our confidence can't be rooted in our own resources. No matter how well prepared or virtuous we would like to think we are, and certainly we should strive to be both well prepared and virtuous, but our confidence can't be in that. Our confidence needs to be rooted in the goodness and the truth of what Jesus has done for us. Whenever we're tempted to stand with the world in what may appear to be a safe and a warm spot, whenever we're tempted to stand with the world rather than with the one who is being interrogated for speaking and living the truth, we should ask ourselves, what are we afraid of? Do we really fear the world's scorn more than we fear being faithless to the one who gave himself for us? The one who died for the world? Do we fear the world more than we love the truth? More than we love the one who spoke and embodied the truth, the one who was and is the way, the truth, and the life. In 1 John chapter 4, verses 17 and 19, John speaks about the way that love enables us to move past our fears. Love has been perfected among us in this, that we may have boldness in the world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because he first loved us. God's love for us, transforming us, empowering us by the Spirit to love others in his name, frees us, can free us from fear, help us not that we won't experience some fear, but that we can rise above it. Notice, frees us from fear even in the face of God's judgment. If we can have confidence on the day of judgment, how much more should we have confidence in the face of whatever the world can throw at us? If love frees us from the fear of God's judgment, how can we be ruled by the fear of the world? And wouldn't we rather, when tested, wouldn't we be prouder when tested? Instead of saying, no, I'm not with him. Wouldn't we be prouder to say, yes, I'm with him. He's my Savior. He's my Lord. Let's pray together.